Did you know that you can create flowers with blanket stitching? You can also stitch a beautiful mosaic. You can then color your mosaic tiles for a really beautiful effect. Join me today and I'll show how I stitched these flowers and the beautiful mosaic behind it and colored in my mosaic at the bottom to create this celebration of color. Let's get started. For this project, I'm using 6-stranded embroidery floss and I'm using 2 strands throughout. I'm also using pearl cotton. Mostly I'm using the size 8 pearl cotton, but I'm also using this black size 12. The size 12 is smaller, it's thinner than the pearl cotton size 8. And you can see here, if I put them side by side, that the size 12 is quite a bit thinner than the size 8. If you don't have size 12 pearl cotton, you can also use 2 strands of embroidery floss. I'm using 3 different types of needles for this project. I'm using a chenille or tapestry needle size 24 for the pearl cotton size 8. For the pearl cotton size 12, which is thinner, I'm using embroidery needles. And for the embroidery floss, where I'm using 2 strands, I'm using Milner's needles. If you take a close look at the difference between the Milner's and embroidery, it's the size of the eye that is quite a bit smaller in the Milner's, and also they're the same width throughout, whereas on the embroidery needle, the eye is a little bit wider than the shaft. So those are the needles I'm using for this project. I'm starting with a fabric collage, and I've taken the time to stitch down all of the pieces using different colors of thread. If you'd like to see this process and how I come up with my collage, I'm going to link to some other videos where you can see how I get to this point. I've chosen floss colors that match with the colors of fabric that I'm using. And then I just go around each little piece of collage and I stitch it down. When it comes to stitching a mosaic, there's 2 options. You can use pearl cotton in your chosen color, or you can use the 6-stranded embroidery floss. And if I separate out 2 strands of the 6-strand embroidery floss, you can see that the thickness is really similar. You could also use 3 strands. The big difference is that the pearl cotton thread is twisted together. So I'm going to choose to use the pearl cotton today to make my mosaic blanket stitch. I'm going to start with a flower. I'm going to choose this orange circle in the middle to make my first flower. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to work to the right. I'm going to hold my thread to the left so that every time I come up with a stitch, it's going to form a loop. So I come up, go through the loop I've created by holding that thread to the left, and that will join the stitch at the top to the one previous. And I'm going to continue moving around in a circle. So I take a stitch starting right at the base of the orange circle. I come out a distance away, about a petal size, and I make my loop. There's a lot of flexibility here. I could make my petals really tall and skinny. I could space them out more. Just be sure to take enough stitches so that your thread isn't pulling, keeping in mind that you're working around a circle. Now I'm ready to start my next flower. I'm going to use this pink piece of fabric as my center, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm coming up, I'm taking a stitch at the base of the pink, coming up with my thread held at the left, making that loop. And I'm just going to work my way around. And when I get back to where I started, I'm going to take my needle down right into the stitch where I started, and I may need to pull it over to make that petal. I'm going to do one more flower with this orange circle, and I'm doing exactly the same thing. making a spiral, and when I get back to the beginning, taking a stitch down to close that circle. So there we are, 3 flowers. You can see they're not perfectly round, but they look very flower-like, very folk arty and whimsical. So now I'm going to add some stems to my flower. I'm going to come in with the same pearl cotton size 8 that I've used to create the flower, and I'm going to use back stitches to create my stem. I'm going to stitch down, and then when I get to the bottom, I'm going to stitch back up to create the other side of my stem. I'm going to do the same thing with the other 2 flowers. I'm going to give them shorter stems, and I'm going to curve the stems a little bit. I think it would be cute to add some leaves to my flowers, so I'm going to stitch them on now, and I'm going to make them small. So here they are stitched, and now that I've got my 3 flowers, the stems and the leaves, I'm ready to add some spiraling blanket stitch. So here's an example of spiraling blanket stitch when I'm using black and white. You can see on one side the background is white stitching, and on the other side the background is black stitching. And it's a really nice effect. So that's what I'm going to do here. I've got the white flowers, and I'm going to do black around these white flowers. It's going to make a really nice contrast. So I'm going to take my pearl cotton size 12 in black, and that's what I'm going to use to create my mosaic. You can also use 2 strands of black embroidery floss, and that would work just as well. So I'm picking a spot, and I'm going to start, and I'm going to move around all of the pieces. The stitch is exactly the same as the stitch that I used to create the flowers. This time I'm just using it to surround all the flowers. So some of the spaces that I'm going to stitch in are going to be really tight around the flowers. So what I can do is take my blanket stitching as far as I can take it into the crevices, and then I can take a stitch down just like I did when I ended the circle, and then I can take my thread from the back and hop over to where I want to continue. So I'm going to travel along the back to take the thread where I want and pop up and continue surrounding these flowers with blanket stitching. It's very common for the thread to get quite twisted when you're doing this stitch. So all you have to do is let go of your needle and let it dangle, and it will untwist, and then you can pick it back up and continue stitching. So you may have to do this once or twice for each length of thread that you're stitching. So just let it hang, untwist it, and continue. When I come to the end of my thread, I tie off at the back. I get a new length, and I just come up in the corner of the last stitch, and I continue where I left off. After working my way around the flower petals, I continue down the stem and around the leaves. At this point, I have to make a choice about where to stitch. So instead of going around that second flower, I'm going to continue down the stem of my first flower, surrounding it with stitches, and I know that I will come back later and surround that other flower. So I get to the bottom of the stem, I turn, and I go back up the other side of the stem. So I have another choice to make as I work my way up the stem, and I decide that I'm going to continue surrounding this stem and its leaves with stitch, knowing that I can hop back again and continue surrounding everything. So I'm getting in these really small, tight spaces, and my goal here is to outline the flowers so that they are part of this continual black spiral. So this is another place where I'm going to start and stop. If it's too far of an area to hop underneath like I did before, I can just tie off, go to the spot I want, come up inside of a stitch, that joins it to the continuous spiral. And then I just start to stitch. So I've worked my way all the way back to where I started. And I'm going to continue with the second row above the first. So in this case, I take a stitch in the base of the previous row, and that connects it to the row before, and I move my way along. So now I have worked my way around my second row on 2 of the flowers and my first row on the 3rd flower. So I have an area to fill in near the bottom. So I'm going to do that next. And now I've filled in that bottom and I've worked my way up to the top. So I'm going to rethread and continue around and around these 3 flowers. So here I've gone around a few more times, and there's going to be some spots where I'm not able to continue. I need to stop and start just to fill in all the small areas. So I'll do that in the same way that I did before. So here's the entire mosaic finished. It's such a beautiful effect, and you can't tell that I've done lots of stopping and starting. It's just one continuous mosaic look. So now I'm looking at the piece, and I want to add some more details right at the base of the stems of the flowers. Just a little more white, just to give everything a little bit more contrast and pop these flowers out a bit, and it makes it look like they're growing out of the ground. So what I'm doing is looking at the mosaic I've created and thinking of each little box outlined in black as a tile. And so I'm stitching inside of the tiles, sort of filling them in with white just to add a little bit more interest. Here you can see I've added the white. It's a small detail, but I'm really happy with the result. So when I look at this piece, the one idea I have is to go around all of the edges of the square in white to create a sort of a frame. And I think that would be a really nice effect. But I have another idea for this piece. I want to add a panel on the bottom, and I'm thinking of turning it into a pouch. So I'm getting out some black fabric, and I like the way that the black fabric looks. So I'm going to stitch it to the bottom. So I have this long piece that's about the right width for this. So I've stitched it to the bottom, and I haven't cut it yet because I'm thinking that I'm going to be able to fold this under as the lining for my pouch. I think it would be a really nice effect to add blanket stitching to this black. Now this is a tone-on-tone effect, so it's not going to be seen quite as much. I think it's going to unify this strip of black with the rest of the stitching. So here's a close-up look of the stitching. You can see it's very subtle, and I think I want to make that pop a bit. So I'm thinking about this mosaic as tiles, and I've decided to come in with some pearl cotton size 8 in the colors of the background and fill in those tiles. So I've used yellow and pink, and now I'm going to come in with a bright blue, and I'm going to add some colors to that. Now for the back of my pouch, I've taken black fabric with felt in between, and I've made slow stitching lines using those same colors of pearl cotton, and I've just gone back and forth. A really simple and really effective, nice detail for the back. So now I'm going to come in with my blue pearl cotton, and I'm going to add some tiles by just filling in some of those little square rectangle shapes of the mosaic. And I'm doing this in a random way, just moving around by eye, just feeling my way intuitively and looking and thinking where would be a nice place. And I just continue. I don't do a lot of thinking about it. I just move along and fill in the spots. So now that that's done, I'm going to stitch together the back and the front. I've folded my black fabric to the back, so that's going to be my lining for the front side. And I'm going to let the stitching show for the lining on the inside because I think it looks really cute. So now I'm going to fold down that black fabric at the top, put right sides together, and stitch my pouch. If you'd like to see me make a pouch in detail, I'm going to link to a video that takes you through the whole process of creating your piece, adding the channels for the drawstrings, and putting the drawstrings in. So here's my piece all stitched together. I've added bright blue drawstrings to the top because I think that really matches well with the blue in the piece. The back's exciting, the front's exciting. I like the shape of this pouch. It's a little longer than some of the ones I've made. Let's take a peek at the inside. You can see that stitching. That adds a nice touch. It's a really fun pouch. Beautiful on the outside and beautiful on the inside. There's so much flexibility with the mosaic stitch. You can fill it in like tiles like I did on the bottom. You can just stitch over bright colors like I did with the black. You can stitch it with white. You can stitch it with any color you want. I hope that this project has sparked some ideas for you in your own stitching practice. Maybe you can make a mosaic using black and white with bright colors. There's so much flexibility. It gives you so many options for creating your own unique piece. Thank you so much for joining me for this project today. I have lots of other videos with ideas and inspiration for your stitching, so check those out too. Until next time, happy stitching.